And we're continuing from the previous video. The first thing that Marius does in his seventh and last consulship is to begin the wholesale slaughter of members of the conservative elite, members of the optimates. And so this is the first time in which the city of Rome, the streets are running red with the blood of Romans, and many of these conservative noblemen choose to commit suicide rather than have their heads taken by somebody and brought to Marius. But this is the first of the proscriptions. The first of the proscriptions belongs to Marius. Marius publishes a list of people that he wants dead, and those who do this deed get to share in a portion of the victim's estate. The heads are brought to Marius, and many of them, the more famous of the victims, are mounted on spears in the Roman Forum behind the rostra. And this endures for nearly 4 years while Sulla is away in the east trying to fight Mithridates. Sulla makes some headway against Mithridates, but he knows he has to return home. During this time, Sulla is even declared a public enemy, and a different army is sent into the east after him, which Sulla has to turn around and defeat in order to make any headway at all. Finally, instead of definitively defeating Mithridates, Sulla is forced to arrange for a treaty in which Mithridates promises not to attack any further territory, and then Sulla, rushes home and establishes himself as dictator. This is a revival of an office that had not been used for 120 years, and during this time Sulla reforms the Roman state according to conservative principles. He restores the preeminency of the Senate and builds up his numbers. He takes the control of the justice system away from the equestrian order and gives it to the Senate, and he also defangs the office of the tribunes of the plebs, which had been one of the major tools of the populace. The tribunes of the plebs, have their veto power taken away from them, and they're removed from the ladder of offices. Once you've been tribune of the plebs, you can't be anything else, and so it's no longer attractive to ambitious men. As dictator, Sulla also engaged in his own series of proscriptions in which members of the populist leadership are slaughtered according to lists of enemies that are prepared and whose assassination is encouraged and rewarded. This is exactly what Marius had done, and in retaliation in part for what Marius had done, as well as to secure the safety of the state, it is also extremely ruthless and violent. It also amounts to wholesale murder. The thing is, Marius did it first, but Sulla is remembered for it because ultimately the populists won. And they're the ones that wrote the history. And in these histories, written during the time of, the last of the populist leaders, the Emperor Augustus, Sulla is presented as much of a monster as possible. And so the last days of Marius are swept under the carpet, and Sulla gets all of the blame for introducing the idea of the assassination of one's enemies as the ruler of Rome, and so forth. Sulla rearranges the Roman state in the interests of the conservative elite, and then, believing in the Roman system, rather than remain as dictator and stay in charge, he steps down as dictator and arranges for elections and for consul, and he sees actually as a sign that the system is working, that the two consuls that are elected are one of them is conservative and one of them is populist. He is able to retire to public life believing that he has restored the Roman state. He dies soon after. But the problem with Sulla is that he establishes these precedents of rearranging Rome by force, first with the March on Rome, and then with his dictatorship. And so what happens afterwards for the duration of the Republic is not the reliable working of the institutions that Sulla established, but rather an increasing resort to force by generals, by warlords that have the power of their armies to back them up. This problem is immediately evident with Pompey. Pompey had come to Sulla as an ally. He was a very young man. He took over for his father, Pompey the Cross-eyed, or Pompey Strabo. Pompey's father had, in support of the Roman government, as restored by Sulla, had engineered the creation of a private army. This is thoroughly illegal, but was very much useful in restoring order in Rome. Sulla had to return from the east and fight a battle, Romans against Romans, at the Colline Gate before the very gate of Rome. This is any allies that he was able to accumulate in putting down the forces of Marius, who had died, but of the Marian forces led by Cinna and Carbo and so forth. Sertorius, all of the Marians that were carrying on Marius's vision of extreme populism. Sulla needed all the supports he could get, and so he tolerated the arrogant Pompey and his illegal private army. But with Sulla dead, Pompey refused to disband his army. And so, there was nothing that the Senate could do about it, other than to send Pompey and his army on increasingly important missions of cleaning up the Marians, first in Spain, and then in the Mediterranean to fight against the pirates. Later, he's sent into the east in order to rearrange the Roman provinces and the Roman rule there. Pompey becomes a permanent problem, and even though he supports the Senate and supports the state, he does so out of opportunistic reasons. Pompey is in it for Pompey, and he is a warlord, that gets his own way because he has an army at his back. Another example of people who seem to be in the column of supporters of the conservative elite, but end up being more complicated, is Cicero. Cicero is one of the most preeminent members of the Senate. He's a very famous orator. He's one of the first people to become a powerful political leader in the Republic without having had military service. He becomes consul as a result of his extreme success as an advocate, as a lawyer in the Roman forums, as an orator. And so, Cicero, we have, huge numbers of his works. We have a great deal of information about Rome during his time because of all the writings he leaves behind and all the speeches that he makes. And Cicero is somebody who wants to be treasured by the conservative elite, but he is a new man. He is like Marius, somebody who has no noble ancestry. And so, he is, sort of in the category of wannabe in this case. And this allows him for a certain cynicism. This allows him to act like a member of the conservative elite and yet stand apart from them because he was never truly accepted. During Cicero's consulship, a conspiracy develops under a man named Catiline. And what's perhaps most famous about this is that Cicero is able to defeat the effectiveness of Catiline's conspiracy. Catiline wants to take over the Roman government in the name of the populace, and Cicero does this. Cicero is able to blunt Catiline's ability to do so through speeches. He makes a speech to the Senate in which Catiline is present, in which he rises in a crescendo of accusations against Catiline while the senators get up and move away from him. So that Catiline ends up sitting alone. There's a battle that takes place afterwards, but it's an anticlimax. But even this, great moment of Roman oratory has an element of controversy in it, which is that the supporters of Catiline are Cicero is so afraid to leave them in place, so afraid to allow a public debate of populist ideas, that he has the supporters of Catiline still present in Rome, executed without trial. And this is later used against the Senate as another example of how they are dedicated to the oppression of the masses, how they are dedicated to anything but the rights and justice of Roman citizens. Instead of being heard, instead of having the needs of the people taken seriously, the conservative elite has once again turned to execution, to assassination, to the illegal enforcement of justice as seen by the conservative elite at all costs. And so, even the consulship of Cicero comes to represent everything that the populace teach the people to hate about the conservative elite. And all this comes to a climax in the time of Caesar, as we'll see in the next video. For now, that's that.